Recently, I was invited by the Minister for Public Service and Administration to lead a team of experts to advise her on establishing a National School of Government. The objective of the National School of Government is to build capacity in the public service on the basis of the fundamentals and imperatives of a developmental state. In addition to that, based on a culture of ethos and service. Now, this public service finds itself in an environment where it has provided services faced with enormous challenges that I think are common knowledge to all. These challenges are interrelated in a cause and effect relationship, where cause and effect are separated in distance and in time, where the causes themselves tend to interlink and have an impact and influence on each other. So that, for instance, you have AIDS, which causes poverty, but at the same time, you have poverty, which causes AIDS. At the same time, AIDS and poverty tend to increase the number of vulnerable children that we have. Indeed, a systemic complexity that confronts government. Indeed, a systemic challenge that confronts this entity which I lead in its establishment so as to build the necessary capacity, as I say, to confront this challenge. Given the challenges, therefore, and the systemic nature, one has got to be very cautious to ensure that one recognizes the ecosystemic nature of this environment. For example, if one were to target a component or a part of the systemic complexity without recognition and the understanding of the holism in this, you are likely to compound further problems in other parts of the system. And we are reminded here by what Einstein tells us, that if you solve a problem, don't use the same mindset that you used when you created the problem. And therefore, this becomes a fundamental challenge in the teaching and learning, the learning and development that has to take place in the school. But in addition to that, and I really appreciate the sequence of the speakers here, because I talk a similar language to the previous speaker. Confronted with complexity, it would be foolhardy and inappropriate not to mobilize the entirety of society, to mobilize the entirety of leadership. And one wants to refer to a concept called collective leadership, if not collective citizenship, where government, the private sector, civil society, as well as citizens and non-citizens, all have to rally around these complex challenges. Now, in the light of this complexity, let me share with you a case study about a crisis that happened recently in our community, and that was the non-delivery of textbooks in one province. Now, normally what happens is books for the next year are budgeted in the previous year so that they are ready for use, for delivery and use in the subsequent year. In 2011, this particular province failed to budget for textbooks, and there was therefore a crisis in 2012. And as is typically the case, the initial reaction was to blame government, to blame government, and to blame government. Yes, certainly, in this crisis, government has some liability. But if you look at the array of players that ought to take responsibility in ensuring that there is adequate and effective education, in ensuring that the necessary textbooks are available. One looks at the role of parents, and you ask yourself, whilst there might be justification in pointing a finger at government, what would have happened if during the first week of the year, parents identified that indeed my child does not have textbooks, and the other parent did, the next parent did, and so forth and so on? Certainly, just from the role that parents could have played, a lot could have been done to avert the crisis. And the list goes on. What about the role of teachers? What about the role of learners? The private suppliers, the provincial government, and so on and so on. And now we know, those of you who have read this case, indeed the NGOs and the judiciary, amongst others, played quite a critical role in resolving this challenge. But clearly this experience dovetails quite well with the previous speakers' views about mobilization of society, collective citizenship. For it simply says, if every member of society, if every structure of society do their share, then there are many disasters and crises that could be averted. And perhaps, if we were to reflect on the experiences coming out of the textbook saga, the omissions on the part of the various players that we have seen, it's almost like we're a society that is moving like this wagon is moving. And I don't think we can afford the picture that we see. We shouldn't be a society that is typified and characterized by this wagon. The National School of Government, therefore, one of the essential things that it is doing in conceptualizing the delivery that it has to be responsible for, takes note of the fact that previous learning and development interventions have tended to focus on individuals and have tended to therefore neglect systemic challenges within organizational contexts and therefore determining capacity needs of teams, of organizations. So that if one were to look at three concentric circles, the area of overlap is the area which the National School of Government should give critical attention to. Normally, when we look at an organization and its ability or otherwise to discharge its mandate, we may want to say, does it have financial resources? Does it have physical resources? Now, over the years since 1994, one thing that the South African government has not really lacked are financial resources. But whether or not those translate to delivery on the ground, perhaps it's a debatable issue. But we may be inclined to think that where there are financial resources and physical resources, there is adequacy and therefore the organization can deliver. But we find that that is in fact not the case. So that we through learning and development, we bring in abilities and skills, and we still find that we need to do more. We bring in systems and structures, we still find that it's not adequate. We bring in strategy and vision, we find that there is fundamental improvement in what we're trying to do vis-a-vis the performance of this organization or this government department, but still there is room for improvement. Then we find that ultimately we see real significant effort and performance on the part of this organization because we have now addressed the very, very fundamental of this organization. The critical challenge in learning and development, therefore, whether you are in an NGO, a private sector, a government department, is actually a cross-cutting approach to learning and development to ensure that all the elements, and particularly and most importantly, those of values and identity are in place. How then would this National School of Government approach that central core of the onion, not a simple question to answer. And maybe if one were to borrow from a very simple and basic thinking of systems thinking around cause and effect, perhaps in designing learning and development, and this not only applies, as I say, to public sector organizations, but to other organizations, it will appreciate that when we make interventions in organizations, in families, and so, we tend to respond to events. Yet, the reality about life is that events are underpinned by patterns, and patterns is actually an accumulation of events over time that actually become the pattern that gives character to the system. But ultimately, what lies beneath the events, the patterns, are systemic structures. And it does appear to me that one fundamental question for the National School of Government, if we are really to crack that very central part called values, beliefs, we have to appreciate the relationship between cause and effect, and really have the discipline of ensuring that as we respond, as we intervene, we are not fooled and get carried away by what superficially appear to be why the system is moving that way instead of moving that way. Thank you very much.